Uber launched with a simple pitch: tap a button, get a ride, skip the taxi entirely. It worked so well that it became one of the fastest-growing tech companies in history. But that same disruption made Uber a target for taxi unions, for regulators, for entire governments that saw an unlicensed, unregulated competitor undercutting an industry built on decades of local rules. Here's exactly where Uber has been banned, forced out, or restricted, and why. China. Uber entered China in 2013, pouring over $1 billion into an aggressive push for market share against a well-funded, deeply entrenched local competitor, Didi Chuxing. Rather than winning that fight outright, Uber cut its losses in 2016, selling its entire China operation to Didi in exchange for a stake in the company. This wasn't a government ban in the traditional sense. It was a strategic retreat. But the practical result is the same. Uber, as an independent operating brand, effectively doesn't exist in China today, replaced entirely by the local competitor it once tried to beat on its own turf: Russia. Uber's situation in Russia followed a similar pattern to China. Facing intense competition from Yandex, Russia's dominant local tech company, with its own deeply established ride-hailing service, Uber merged its Russian operations with Yandex.Taxi in 2017 rather than continue competing directly. Uber retained a minority stake in the combined entity, but as an independently operating standalone brand, Uber effectively exited the Russian market, another case where market consolidation, not government prohibition, ended Uber's direct presence. Denmark. Denmark's conflict with Uber was regulatory, not competitive. In 2017, Danish lawmakers passed new taxi regulations requiring all ride-hailing vehicles to install specific seat sensors and fare meters. Equipment Uber's model wasn't built around. Rather than comply, Uber chose to exit the Danish market entirely that same year. The story didn't end there, though. Uber returned to Denmark in 2025 using a hybrid approach, allowing customers to book through the Uber app while the actual ride is fulfilled by Driver, a Copenhagen-based licensed taxi company, a workaround that let Uber re-enter the market by partnering with, rather than replacing, the local regulated taxi system it had originally clashed with. Hungary. Hungary took a more directly adversarial approach. In June 2016, the Hungarian parliament passed legislation explicitly granting the country's National Communications Authority the power to block what it legally classified as illegal dispatch services from being accessed online, a law written specifically in response to Uber's operations. Uber suspended service in Hungary shortly after, unable to operate under a legal framework that treated its entire business model as unauthorized dispatching, rather than a legitimate transportation service. Bulgaria. Bulgaria banned Uber after regulators and courts determined the company was engaging in unfair trade practices, specifically operating without meeting the same licensing, insurance, and safety requirements imposed on traditional taxi operators. As in several other European cases, the core legal argument wasn't that ride-hailing itself was illegal. It was that Uber was competing directly against a heavily regulated industry while sidestepping the regulations that industry was legally required to follow. London, United Kingdom. London represents one of the most closely watched Uber battles in the world, precisely because it wasn't a simple, permanent ban. Transport for London refused to renew Uber's operating license in both 2017 and 2019, citing safety and security concerns, including how Uber handled reporting serious incidents and verifying driver identities. Rather than exiting the market, Uber fought the decision through appeals while implementing significant operational changes, including improved safety features and stronger accountability measures. After demonstrating those changes to regulators, Uber was eventually granted a new license, a rare example of a near-total ban being reversed once a company adapted to meet a regulator's specific demands. Vancouver, Canada. While Uber operates across most of Canada, Vancouver specifically maintained restrictions that made ride-hailing effectively unworkable within city limits, for years longer than most other major Canadian cities, tied to provincial insurance requirements and licensing rules that took considerably longer to resolve in British Columbia than in provinces like Ontario, where Uber launched much earlier. UberPop across the European Union. Beyond Uber's standard, professional driver service, the company also launched UberPop, a peer-to-peer version allowing regular, non-professionally licensed drivers to pick up paying passengers using their own personal vehicles. This specific service was banned outright in Italy, France, Finland, and the Netherlands, all citing safety concerns tied to unlicensed, non-commercially insured drivers operating essentially as unregulated taxis. Notably, in most of these countries, Uber's standard, professional driver service remained legal. The ban targeted UberPop's specific peer-to-peer model, not Uber's broader operation. The Philippines. In 2017, the Philippines Land Transportation Franchising and Regulatory Board issued a cease and desist order against Uber over its continued use of unregistered drivers, despite a prior government order restricting new driver sign-ups. Uber initially appealed the decision but ultimately complied, temporarily suspending its entire Philippine operation while working to resolve its licensing dispute with regulators. A clear example of a government agency using a direct suspension order to force a multinational company into compliance. Why banned rarely means gone for good. Here's the pattern running underneath nearly every country on this list. Uber's conflicts almost never stem from a government deciding ride-hailing itself is undesirable. They stem from a much narrower recurring dispute: Uber's business model colliding with existing taxi regulation, insurance law, and driver licensing requirements built for a completely different transportation system. China and Russia weren't bans at all. They were competitive retreats. Denmark, Hungary, and Bulgaria were regulatory standoffs. London was a safety dispute that Uber eventually resolved through compliance, not exit. The Philippines was a licensing enforcement action. What actually happens, over and over, is negotiation, adaptation, or strategic retreat, rarely a permanent, unconditional door slammed shut. Denmark's hybrid return through Driver and London's reinstated license both prove the same point. A banned headline is often just the opening chapter of a longer regulatory negotiation, not the final word. Putting it together. So when you hear Uber is banned somewhere, the real story usually involves one of a handful of specific mechanisms: losing a direct competitive battle to an entrenched local rival, refusing to meet new safety or insurance regulations, operating an unlicensed peer-to-peer service that skirts commercial driving law, or falling out of compliance with a specific licensing authority. Same disruptive business model, several completely different reasons it's run into a wall, country by country, city by city, each one revealing exactly what that specific government valued more: disruption or regulation. Subscribe to Faulty Blueprint, because every failure, every restriction, every banned product has a design behind it, and we're just getting started.